Imagine the sound of ice cracking beneath your feet. And then, suddenly, you're plunged into freezing black water, with no way out. That's exactly what happened to 12-year-old Daniel on a quiet winter afternoon. His small hand was the only thing left above the surface, while the icy river pulled him under. The clock was ticking, every second bringing him closer to death. But just when all hope seemed lost, a firefighter in bright orange gear crawled across the cracking ice to attempt one of the most dangerous rescues imaginable. On a bitterly cold afternoon, in the heart of winter, in a quiet American town, where the river ran wide and deep, the landscape looked calm and still, blanketed in white snow and glittering frost. But beneath the surface of that peaceful scene lay danger that no one could see, danger that waited silently for a single mistake. The river, coated with a thin sheet of ice, seemed solid to the eye, but anyone who had lived near water in winter knew the truth. That early season ice could not be trusted. That beneath its glassy surface churned freezing currents, strong enough to pull even the strongest man under. On that day, 12-year-old Daniel, a bright and energetic boy, full of laughter and curiosity, went out with two friends to play near the riverbank. They tossed snowballs, chased one another, and shouted with the joy that only children can feel in the heart of winter. They dared each other to step closer and closer to the edge, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their boots crunching against the brittle snow. The river, beautiful but deadly, reflected the pale winter sun, and to Daniel's young eyes, it looked like an open playground, a place to test courage, a place to take risks. His friends shouted warnings, half joking and half serious, as boys often do. But Daniel, braver and perhaps a little too bold, stepped farther out onto the frozen surface. At first, the ice held, giving him confidence. But then, with a sharp and terrible crack, the world beneath him gave way. In an instant, the icy sheet broke, and Daniel plunged into the freezing black water below. The shock of the cold stole the air from his lungs. His friends screamed in panic, calling his name again and again as he struggled to stay above the surface. The jagged edges of broken ice cut into his hands as he tried to pull himself up, but the current dragged him downward, and the hole was already starting to close with floating shards of ice. The boys on the bank shouted desperately, their cries carrying across the frozen landscape, but there was no one nearby to hear. No one except the wind and the river itself. Daniel's small hands beat against the ice, searching for a grip, his lips turning blue within moments, his young body overwhelmed by the merciless cold. Each second that passed was another second closer to death. Far down the road, a woman walking her dog heard the desperate shouts. She could barely make out the words, but knew at once that something was terribly wrong. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911, her voice urgent and frantic as she reported that a child had fallen through the ice. Within minutes, though to those who watched it felt like hours, the wail of sirens pierced the winter air. Fire trucks and ambulances roared down the icy streets, their red lights flashing against the white snow. Neighbors came out of their houses, drawn by the sound, their faces filled with worry. At the riverbank, firefighters in heavy gear leapt into action, their training kicking in. Their movements fast but careful. They knew the truth. Cold water could kill in minutes, and Daniel's life was hanging by a thread. The commander barked orders, his voice firm and calm, even as tension gripped the crowd. A rescue line was tied to the waist of a firefighter, dressed in a bright orange survival suit, his body encased in gear that would allow him to crawl across the fragile ice without breaking through. Every step mattered. The ice groaned and cracked beneath his weight as he inched forward on his stomach, spreading his body to distribute pressure. The crowd watched in silence, their breaths visible in the air, their hearts beating in time with his slow, careful movements. Behind him, his team held the rope tightly, ready to pull him and the boy back at a single signal. Daniel's cries had grown weaker. The cold was pulling him under, his small body going limp as the freezing water numbed his arms and legs. His head dipped beneath the surface once, twice, and each time it was harder for him to rise again. But just as his strength began to fail, the rescuer reached him. With one swift motion, the firefighter grabbed Daniel by the collar, pulling his head above the water, holding him firmly against his chest. "We've got him," someone shouted from the shore, and a ripple of relief passed through the crowd. But the danger was not over yet. Slowly, inch by inch, the rescuer and the boy were pulled back toward the bank, the rope straining, the ice cracking ominously beneath them. At one point, the rescuer's leg broke through, plunging into the freezing water, but he held tightly onto Daniel, refusing to let go, his own training and courage driving him forward. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, they reached solid ground. Helping hands reached out, pulling them both onto the shore. The rescuer laid Daniel gently onto the snowy earth, his body pale, his lips a frightening shade of blue. Paramedics rushed forward. Oxygen mask, chest compressions, warm blankets, every second counted. Daniel's mother, who had been running down the road, breathless and frantic, arrived at that very moment, falling to her knees beside her son. She cried his name, begged him to breathe, her tears freezing in the bitter wind. The paramedics worked with practiced urgency, pumping his chest, warming his body, calling out vital signs, refusing to give up. For a long, terrible moment, the only sounds were the shouts of the rescue team and the sobs of his mother. The crowd stood in silence, praying, waiting, and then at last a sound broke the stillness. A cough, faint at first, then stronger, followed by a sharp gasp of air. Daniel's chest rose, his body convulsed, and life returned where only moments before there had been none. His mother cried out in relief, clutching his hand, thanking God, thanking the rescuers, her voice shaking with gratitude. Around them, people cheered, some with tears in their eyes, moved by the miracle they had just witnessed. Daniel was quickly wrapped in heated blankets, lifted onto a stretcher, and carried into the waiting ambulance. His eyes opened briefly, meeting his mother's, and in that look was all the love, all the hope, and all the relief of a family given a second chance. The ambulance doors closed, and with sirens wailing, it sped away toward the hospital. The crowd slowly dispersed, each person carrying with them the memory of what they had seen. The fragility of life, the courage of rescuers, the miracle of survival. Mothers would remind their children never to walk on the ice. Fathers would recall the bravery of the firefighter who risked his own life. And neighbors would remember the moment when an entire community came together to save one child. The frozen river, once silent and peaceful, now stood as a reminder of both danger and hope. It had nearly claimed a young life, but through courage, training, and teamwork, that life had been saved. Daniel's story spread far beyond his small town, carried by local news, retold in church services, spoken of in school assemblies. He became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of survival, of what can happen when people act quickly, bravely, and together. That day, as the sun set and the river grew quiet again, the ice reflected the orange glow of the horizon. It looked just as calm as it had before, but to those who had stood on its banks, it would never again seem harmless. They had seen its danger, but also its power to bring people together. And in the memory of one boy's near death and miraculous rescue, they found a lasting lesson. That life is fragile, every second is precious, and heroes walk among us, ready to crawl across the ice, ready to fight the freezing water, ready to hold on to life with all their strength. That day was not just about one boy, it was about every parent's nightmare, every rescuer's duty, and every community's hope. It was a reminder that even in the coldest and darkest of moments, there is light, there is courage, and there is always the chance of a miracle. End.